Bienvenidos. This is the Paseo podcast. I am your host, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon. Our guest today is Mónica Feliú Mójer. She is a scientist and science communication expert with a Ph.D. in neurobiology who has dedicated herself to engage historically underserved and overlooked audiences, especially Puerto Ricans and other Spanish speakers, with science. So without further ado, Mónica, welcome to the Paseo podcast. How you doing today?
Gracias, Joshua. Hola, everyone. I'm doing great.
I want to talk about this project, and you were the lead on this community engagement project, Aquí Nos Cuidamos. And that was a project that was done under the nonprofit organization Cincia, Puerto Rico. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization and the project?
Sure. So Cincia Puerto Rico is a nonprofit organization that brings together anyone with an interest in science in Puerto Rico. Not necessarily scientists, not necessarily Puerto Ricans, although most of the people in our network, we have a network of more than 15,000 people across the globe. Most people are scientists, but we also have, and they are Puerto Rican, but we also have educators, we have students, and we just have, citizens that are interested in science in Puerto Rico. So what brings together our community is that common interest, and then that commitment to put their knowledge and their resources in service of Puerto Rico. And so as an organization, we tap into the collective knowledge of that community to create social impact. And we do that through science communication and community engagement. And that's where the project that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, Aquí Nos Cuidamos, falls. But we also have like media collaborations with newspapers and radio stations in Puerto Rico to highlight La Ciencia Boricua. We have projects that are focused on improving science education in Puerto Rican schools, particularly by providing kids in Puerto Rico with role models that are relevant to their culture and their context. We have programs that are focused on supporting the professional development of scientists and training. And then more broadly, what we do is we promote the civic engagement of the scientific community in Puerto Rican society. We believe that, science is as much part of Puerto Rican culture as music or food. And it should play a role in all aspects of our society. It touches many, many aspects of our lives, but, science and scientists don't necessarily have a role in some areas, like in policy, for example, or decision making. And so as an organization, we try to promote that civic role and that civic participation of the scientific community. And so Aquí Nos Cuidamos in particular is a project of Cincia Puerto Rico. And it's a community-centered project that it's focused on promoting COVID-19 prevention and overall well-being in marginalized and communities. And we do that through multimedia science and public health education, through community engagement, supporting the work of communities in different ways, and through science and solidarity. So Aquí Nos Cuidamos we started this project in September of 2020. So it was really inspired by what was going on with the pandemic, particularly with the reality that just generally there is a lack of timely, culturally relevant, accurate science information in Spanish. There's much less of that than there is in English. And that's a chronic challenge. So it's not something that is new to the pandemic. But, when you're in a public health emergency, having access to timely information that you can understand and that you can act upon, it's even more important. It could make the difference within health and sickness. And so we thought one of the early responses of our organization of Cincia Puerto Rico to the pandemic, because we've had these media collaborations, was really essentially put our community of scientists out there to talk about COVID, to explain what was happening, what we knew, what we didn't know. And so we noticed that there was an opportunity for us to create materials, educational materials that could help people, particularly people who were not scientists, who perhaps didn't have the expertise that our community had, to then educate others, to educate themselves and educate others. And so we thought, well, what if we create a multimedia kit, like a box of tools that people say like, oh, I need to learn more about this. I'm going to pull this tool from this kit, from this toolbox. And so that was the original idea behind Aquí Nos Cuidamos. It became much more than that. But in general, the project has two main components: this multimedia education toolkit and a community engagement program. And this toolkit that we created has more than 200 multimedia assets, from videos, audios, posters, infographics, manuals, and it has 4 public service campaigns that are focused on COVID-19 prevention, vaccination, and mental health. And one of the things that's pretty unique about how we designed this project is, from the beginning, we knew that we wanted to focus on serving communities that have been historically marginalized, because those are the communities that have been disproportionately negatively impacted by the pandemic. And so we created this toolkit, and that's free. It's available for free. Anyone can use it. It's still, 2 years into the pandemic. It is still very relevant. And so that's one of the core aspects of Aquí Nos Cuidamos. The other is a community engagement program. And that community engagement program was born really as we were creating this toolkit. We realized, people needed support to understand how they could use this toolkit. The response after we launched our first of the 4 campaigns was like, this is beautiful, it's really cool. And that was great to hear, but we really wanted people to use it. And so we realized we need to kind of help people understand how this toolkit can help you and can serve your needs. So we started doing workshops to train epidemiologists, health educators, community leaders in Puerto Rico on how they could take advantage of that. That community engagement program also features different collaborations with community-based organizations, nonprofits, government agencies like the Puerto Rico House of Representatives, because we are a small team. And we realized through partnerships, we could amplify our impact. So that's also been an important part of this community engagement program. And then finally, and I think for me, one of the most impactful aspects of Aquí Nos Cuidamos is a community ambassadors program. So in Puerto Rico, because of government incompetence and institutional failures, communities, particularly marginalized and vulnerable communities, they've had to rely on each other. There's a long tradition of autogestión, of self-reliance in Puerto Rico, where if communities need to come up with their own solutions because institutions have failed them. And so in Puerto Rico, there are probably thousands of community leaders, people that respond to the needs and priorities of their people. And they come up with solutions, programs to address their needs and priorities. And so we knew that these people had a key role in responding to the pandemic, but also that they had the trust of their communities in this entire response, especially in such an uncertain situation. So we created a program. We basically we did an application process. We selected 10 leaders from across Puerto Rico, a really diverse group of leaders that represents Puerto Rico. We have leaders who live in public housing projects, who are Black, who are women, predominantly women. We have leaders who are religious leaders. We have a nun, we have a pastor in our group. We have two of our ambassadors who are deaf. And so this group really represents the many different realities in Puerto Rico. And we have worked with them to support their work more closely by providing them with funding, with mental health workshops, with communications and graphic design help, and really creating a community of support, so that they can learn from each other and help each other throughout the past year and a half. So it's been a really, Aquí Nos Cuidamos has been a really comprehensive project. It's been really ambitious too. We started with this idea of the toolkit, and it became a lot more than that.
I find this project so interesting, Monica, because I just feel like here in the States, when we talk about COVID information, I think there's just a lot of distrust amongst a population of the public. The distrust in institutions, distrust in our medical system. When I think about Puerto Rico, it's hard for me not to apply that same lens to how people would receive getting information on COVID-19 on La Isla. Because I think about Puerto Rican women being sterilized in the early 1900s. Like I think about stuff like that. So I feel like when you have those institutional failures and you have that ingrained in people's memory, that there might be a bit more hesitancy to receive information that they can trust from medical personnel. So this idea of using community responders, community advocates to really act as your point people in communities you're working with, I think that's such a really great method to implement.
No, but I agree with you. I mean, I think they're really key cultural differences between Puerto Rico and the States. There is, from our experience, there is mistrust in institutions, and there is mistrust in establishment in general. And there, as you mentioned, the example of the birth control pill and how it was tested on Puerto Rican women, and a lot of Puerto Rican women were sterilized. They were tested on without their consent. They were sterilized without their knowing. And there's a long history of abuse of science and medicine against different marginalized populations, Puerto Ricans included. There's also mistrust in the government at the federal level, but also at the local level. But I think there is one key cultural difference that we have seen, and I think has really made a difference in how the pandemic has impacted Puerto Rico versus different places in the States. And that is it's really our collective care. In Puerto Rico, we are about community, like culturally is about, and that's one of the reasons why our project is called Aquí Nos Cuidamos, which loosely translates to here we take care of each other. The project really embodies an important part of our cultural identity. We are very much community focused. Solidarity is a core value in Puerto Rico. And because we have had to take care of each other in some instances, because we've been left with no other choice, but because taking care of each other is such an important part of how we live, we really tapped into that. And so in our project, at least, we haven't seen the level of pushback that, if you compare it to different communities in the US, and just generally how there's a lot more polarization in their response. to COVID in the States, we haven't seen, I mean, of course, there is polarization, but it hasn't been as strong in Puerto Rico. And I think it speaks to a key cultural difference between, how Puerto Ricans live their lives versus in the States, where the culture in the States is a lot more individualistic, is about me and about what's good for me. And I'm going to, I don't want to wear my mask because it is my freedom. It's not about, am I helping you? Am I helping keep the other person next to me healthy? It's like, I don't care about that. It's about me and how I feel. Whereas in Puerto Rico, our approach is really driven by that solidarity and that collective care.
Would love to hear, if you have one, a story of when you were working in a community and maybe someone or a group of people maybe pushed back against some of the information that was being shared on COVID-19. Like, can you share a story of that and kind of like how you handled it, how your team approached those particular individuals or that individual?
Yeah. So one of the things with the way that we carried out this project is that, we were really relying on our community ambassadors to kind of be the spokespeople for our project. And what we've heard from them is, they would post things on Facebook or on WhatsApp. Facebook and WhatsApp are really, really popular in Puerto Rico. And so our community leaders would, take content from our toolkit and share it, and they would get questions, they would get pushback. I mean, some of them would even get like attacked. And so, there was some of that, and there was some of the, I think, one of the things that you see with anti-vaccine folks, or at least vaccine skeptical folks, is that there are particular tropes that they use, and they use them over and over and over and over again. So it's like, oh, the vaccine, it's like, there's conspiracy theories, and those are one extreme, but then there are others that are genuine questions. Like one thing we would hear very often was like, the vaccines were made too quickly. And so for us, that would be an opportunity to first acknowledge, well, yeah, that is true. The vaccines, from the moment they were started to the way they came when they came to market, that was pretty fast. But here are the reasons why. So those questions would be an opportunity for us to first acknowledge it is okay to have questions. It is normal to have questions. It is healthy to ask questions. But, that's one of the things that we want. We want people to ask questions and think critically. And so, we would acknowledge and respect that people were asking questions. We would also acknowledge where some of those questions were coming from. Those questions are coming from fear. They're coming from fear of the unknown, of uncertainty. They're coming perhaps from certain values or beliefs, from previous experiences. And so each of those questions were an opportunity for us to try to understand, where are people coming from and how do we find common ground? And so we were, in our work, we were mostly trying to support the community leaders to kind of understand, the kind of behind the scenes of, this is how misinformation works. This is why people may be saying these things and asking these questions. And here are tools to help you respond in a respectful and, with empathy, because I think there is a lot of, well, if you don't agree with me, that means that you are wrong, or it means that you are dumb, and it means that you don't have the right information. So I'm just going to give you the information and that's going to fix it. And that is not how people think or evaluate information.
Really happy to hear that a part of the project that was kind of baked into the process when working with community responders and advocates was this idea of, let's show you how to talk to people. Because ideally in those situations, you of course want cooler heads to prevail, where you're leading with facts and empathy, as opposed to this very like finger pointing, accusatory, defensive stance.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so looking at the project as a whole, and you've touched on this a few points during our conversation, Monica. But what were the results so far? I mean, I know it's still an ongoing project, but what are some of the results
Yeah.
you're seeing? Because it sounds like you've had some really positive ones.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this project has really exceeded our expectations. You know, like we've created more than 200 multimedia assets. They're all available for free on our website, aquinoscuidamos.org. You know, the content has been accessed by like almost 20,000 people from about 100
Wow.
countries around the world. So, you know, we're seeing not just people in Puerto Rico, but in other Spanish speaking countries use Aquí Nos Cuidamos. You know, our content has been broadcasted by more than a dozen radio and TV stations as public service announcements. You know, content has been shared, you know, probably thousands of times on social media. And those, you know, those are the numbers, right? I think for me, the biggest impact of Aquí Nos Cuidamos has been the relationships that we've built. The relationship we've built with community-based organizations and their leaders and community leaders, because that, especially working directly with marginalized communities, wasn't something that we were doing as directly as an organization before the pandemic started. You know, Cincia Puerto Rico has always focused on equity and underrepresented populations. We had never worked as directly with marginalized communities in Puerto Rico as we are now. So for me, that is really, really important. And that's the most impactful thing. You know, we've been able to build trusting relationships with populations that, you know, perhaps they've never met a scientist before. You know, we've been able to build relationships with the deaf community in Puerto Rico, which, you know, it's a community I'd never worked with until Aquí Nos Cuidamos. And it's a, you know, when you look at the universe of marginalized populations in Puerto Rico, a lot of people in these communities, they really live at the intersection of marginalizations. So it's not just, you know, they're Black, they're immigrant, or they're poor, but they're all of those things. And that intersectionality can create additional challenges. But you know, within marginalized communities in Puerto Rico, the deaf community is incredibly marginalized. And you know, being able to learn from them and learn about them and the challenges that they have to deal with to live everyday life. You know, accessibility of information is a huge problem for the deaf community. You know, for example, before starting this project, I thought, you know, we knew we were going to create videos, and we thought, you know, we're just caption the videos, and that's because that's what you see on TV, right? Like you see TV channels with closed captions, and you're like, yeah, that's enough. But then when we started really listening to the deaf community, we realized the educational challenges they face are so huge. There are some deaf people that do not have the reading proficiency to read captions. And so if you really want to make things accessible and inclusive of the deaf community, you need to have interpreters. And so we had to shift. We had to shift our budget. We have to shift our process so that we could make sure that every single content, audiovisual content we were creating could include an interpreter, that every single community forum or talk or event we did, we could have an interpreter, because we are committed to making science accessible and inclusive. And so if we want to be true to that, then we actually need to make sure that people in the deaf community are included. And so to me, those lessons that we've learned about, you know, how these communities and their leaders all of the amazing things that they do with very little resources, with very little appreciation, and being able to come in and say, we are here to put science in service of what you do, and we are in equal footing. One of the things that's been really important for us has been the recognition that communities do science. There's a lot of community, local, ancestral scientific knowledge in these communities is not recognized as science by academia. Probably people in those communities would not call it science. It's just the way they do things. But fundamentally, it is science. And so we've been trying to shift this, archetype and the stereotypes of who's a scientist, who does science, who creates scientific knowledge with the way that we've been working with communities. And to me, that is more valuable than the numbers. Like, the numbers are fantastic. We've had, we estimate that we have reached more than 200,000 people in Puerto Rico alone. And that's probably underestimating how many people our content has reached. And that is great, but it's really about those lasting, trusting relationships, because through those, we can dismantle certain injustices. And I think we can continue to build upon that to create systemic change, so that ultimately, these communities are not going to have to rely on each other. Like, they're not going to have to rely on autogestión to survive, but they're going to be able to rely on autogestión to build the life they deserve, so that they can live with dignity.
So you go through this project, and fast forward a few months, if I'm getting my timelines down correctly, you won the Breakthrough of the Year in Science Engagement Award, or the project won the Breakthrough of the Year in Science Engagement Award. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance behind that? Like, what is, and I'll be honest, first time I ever heard of Falling Walls was reading this article with you on the cover, like super excited after winning the award. So I'm like oblivious. What is Falling Walls, and why is this award so significant?
Falling Walls they're a foundation that are based in Berlin, Germany. And it was created around this idea of the falling of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall fell in November 9th of 1989, I think. I think that's the year. I don't remember. I was alive, but I don't remember. But yeah, so it's built around this idea of breaking walls between science and society. And so they have a summit that is celebrated, on those days. The main summit falls always on November 9th, which is the anniversary of when the Berlin Wall fell. And they recognize that, I think they have 10 different categories where they recognize breakthroughs, people that are coming up with innovative solutions and that are in different ways breaking walls between science and society. And in particular, the science engagement category recognizes projects that are breaking the walls between science and the public. And really it's different public, because this idea of like the general public, quote unquote, the general public doesn't exist. The general public is many different publics. It's not homogeneous. But it's really about, projects that are connecting science with different aspects of society, addressing important societal problems. And so we entered the competition in 2021. We were first selected as one of the 50 finalists for this. And I think we were competing against 189 projects from across the globe. Wow. Then we were selected as one of the 20 winners. And as one of the 20 winners, you get to travel to Berlin to pitch your project. Is, you have 5 minutes to pitch, what did you do? What was the impact? Why is it important? And then from there, an international jury of experts in science engagement, they select the Breakthrough of the Year. So it's the most outstanding project in that category. And Aquí Nos Cuidamos was selected as as breakthrough of the year. And this was, I mean, it was incredible. I don't play sports, but that's the way I felt that day. It's like how I imagine an Olympian would feel when they get on that podium. Like, that's how I imagine like Yasmin Camacho Queen felt when she was like getting that, gold medal and listening to La Borinqueña. That's how I imagine she felt. Like, it was amazing. And it was amazing for many reasons. One, the event was being live streamed. And I knew that my team and that our ambassadors were watching. It was like, I don't know, it was like 9 a.m. in Puerto Rico. And I know that they were watching, and I know the sign language interpreter that we've been working with, like, she got up early so that she could interpret the live streaming for our deaf ambassadors so that they could be part of it. And so like, it was really incredibly meaningful. And it was such an honor for me to be there and represent them. Like, I truly felt, I get emotional remembering it, because I truly felt like I had them with me. Like, it wasn't just me. I was really representing these communities that are invisibilized so often and rarely ever recognized. And so it was meaningful for that reason. It was meaningful because, this is an international recognition. By winning Breakthrough of the Year, that meant that we got to present, or I got to present, Aquí Nos Cuidamos on the main stage of the summit. And like, on the same session, like, I presented to people after a Nobel Prize winner in physics. Like, during that day, one of the speakers earlier in the day was one of the inventors of the Pfizer COVID vaccine. So like, this is pressure. Like no pressure, right? Like, big deal people. And just being able to present this project that has created such impact and that personally means so much to me, it was amazing. And it also validates the value of what we've been doing. If I had $1 for every time that I've heard, oh, who cares about Puerto Rico? Like, why should I care about science in Puerto Rico? Why should I care about communities in Puerto Rico? How does this apply to any other community in the States? I would have a lot of dollars. And to me, that was like, well, take that. Like, it was really validation of like, what we are doing is, I mean, just because of the fact that it's created an impact in Puerto Rico, that is enough. But it's a validation of like what we are doing. Like, you can learn from what we're doing. And this could be of impact for other communities. And so it's been one of the best experiences of my life.
Hola, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon here, founder and host of the Paseo podcast. Thanks for listening to the show, where we highlight stories by, from, and about the Puerto Rican community, from La Isla to the diaspora. If you want to help us share the diverse and vibrant stories that make up the Puerto Rican communities here on Paseo, Boricua, and Chicago, and around the world, subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream your podcasts. Subscribing helps more people find the show and will help you make sure you never miss an episode. Leaving a 5-star rating and showing some love in the comments helps too. You can also give a donation by looking up the Paseo podcast on savechicagomedia.org. Okay, that's enough from me. Enjoy the show. Have you ever had anybody assume that you didn't have a PhD or was surprised that you had a PhD? Like, I mean, any of those microaggressions thrown your way?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like, oh, you don't look like a scientist, or, I've been in instances where like I am with male colleagues and they are called doctor and I'm called Monica, and I'm like, excuse me, like I'm a doctor too. And, I've been in instances where people condescendingly try to be like, oh, whatever. And I'm like, well, yeah, I have a PhD from Harvard. Thank you very much. And I really hate doing those things. But I am also very aware of the privileges that, the educational opportunities I've had allow me. I am very aware of There are some spaces where saying I am a doctor can open doors for me just because of the assumptions that people make about that. I'm also very aware that although I am Puerto Rican and I have an accent, most places, if I enter a room and people don't hear me speak, they think I'm a white woman. And that allows me privileges that, my colleagues and friends who are Black women don't have, for example. And so I'm hyper aware of those privileges. And so what I do is I think about, well, how do I use them to accomplish what I want? And what I want is more equity and inclusion. And so I very much try to use those privileges to my advantage.
For other women of color with PhDs in I would say probably, yeah, I'd say in higher ed, have gone to get their master's, PhDs. Any advice that you have for any women listening that, on how to kind of navigate those microaggressions and really, take up space in a room?
I'm giving my answer in that context of there are certain privileges that I can't escape. But I think one of the most valuable lessons I've learned along the way in my career is that when you come from a minoritized or a marginalized background, especially if you have more than one of those marginalized identities, the narrative that you are told and the narratives that are told about you is about deficit. You succeeded in spite of who you are. You succeeded in spite of growing up in a working class community, in a rural working class community where educational opportunities were not plentiful. You succeeded in spite of being a woman. And while there are challenges, systemic challenges that come with certain identities just because of the way that we have been historically marginalized, I found a lot of power in reclaiming that narrative in the fact that I've succeeded because of who I am. Sure, I grew up in a rural working class community where opportunities were not plentiful, but that means I had to be resourceful. I also grew up in a place where I learned how to milk a cow early on. Can everyone say that? Probably not. I don't know if I could still milk a cow, but I could feel myself, I could feed myself if I had to. And so I've learned to kind of flip that narrative. And so for me, there's been a lot of power in reclaiming that narrative and not allowing others to force those false narratives of deficit on me and how I protect myself and how others see myself. So, there is power, a lot of power in your identities and in your experiences. And so I would encourage people to step into the power of those identities and their experiences and how they add value to, science or higher education or whatever space of power they enter.
This is a question we've been asking all of our guests. And it's one that I find to be one of the most interesting questions to ask Boricuas, diaspora, and La Isla, because I get a different answer every time. And I would be curious to hear from you, Monica. What does being Puerto Rican mean to you?
Everything.
Good answer. I love
it. No, really, like being Puerto Rican is such an important part of not just my personal identity, but my professional identity. All of the experiences that I had from, growing up, I've said this, I feel like a million times already, in a rural working class community, that really shaped my interest in science. It really shaped the way I understand and see the world. It really shaped how a lot of what I do is rooted in community. The very first scientists, and I didn't realize this until I was a grown adult, The very first scientist I ever met was this elder in my community who used to help milking our cows and like tending to the farm where I grew up in. He had a second grade education, but he knew more about science, like animals and plants and the weather and patterns more than any PhD scientist I've ever met. And that really is foundational. It really shapes the way that I see the world. It really shapes my work and how I want science to be a tool for liberation in Puerto Rico, and for people to have dignity in their lives, to have the life that they deserve, to be able to ask critical questions, not just of scientists and of physicians, but of the government. And so for me, being a Puerto Rican scientist is who I am. It's at the core of who I am, or how I see things, of how I do everything. And so for me, really being Puerto Rican means everything. For me, la Ciencia Boricua is generous, is it's solidary, and I think there is something very unique about that, about being Puerto Rican scientist. Yes, there are many challenges, and those challenges, of course, have shaped me, but they also have given me the opportunity to learn really important lessons. And so again, for me, being Puerto Rican is my most important identity.
For people that are listening that want to keep up with you, with your work, how can they do that? Well, give us all the things: website, social media. How
Yeah.
can people keep up with you?
Yeah. So people can find me on my website, monicafeliu.me. So that's MONICAFELIU.me. It's hard for me to spell in English. They can also find me on Twitter at Moefeliu, MOEFELIU. I'm pretty active on Twitter. And so that's the best way to kind of keep up with me. If they want to learn more about Ciencia Puerto Rico, they can find it on all major social media platforms: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. If you just search Ciencia Puerto Rico, you'll find it. And then Aquí Nos Cuidamos we use the hashtag Aquí Nos Cuidamos PR. And I'm not going to spell that.
You're good. People listening will know. You're fine. Yeah.
But you can find us using that hashtag on social media, and you can also go to aquinoscuidamos.org to find all of our content, which again is available for free for anyone to use. In addition to following Ciencia Puerto Rico on social media, we are a nonprofit. So if you want to support our work, you can go to Yo Apoyo Ciencia PR, and maybe you can add that in the show notes.
We'll put it in the show notes.
You can
No
also
te
find us. Yeah, you can also find us on PayPal. And for those of you that are in Puerto Rico, we are also on ATH Móvil. So if you search for Ciencia PR, Ciencia PR, you can find us and you can donate to what we do, and so that we can keep up the good work promoting science in Puerto Rico.
Dr. Mónica Feliú Mójer, thank you so much for being on the show. It's not every day we get a scientist on the show, so really appreciate you making time for us today.
Gracias. I appreciate you too. Thank you so much for the opportunity.